Welcome back to Friday Night Arcade. Thank you for stopping by and checking out the channel. Thank you very much for your support. This week, I'm going to be taking a look back at Wing Commander on the Super Nintendo. About a week or two ago, Jay and I were in the mood for playing some sort of space simulator game, and we ended up trying out Elite Dangerous, which is a modern space simulator, and it's a very pretty game to look at, and the graphics are certainly impressive, but to be perfectly honest, I found it to be boring. It basically felt like one big spreadsheet simulator set in deep space. And that made me remember how much fun I had playing Wing Commander on Super Nintendo. Now, I know that the PC version is probably superior, but here's the thing. I couldn't afford a gaming computer when I was a kid in the 90s. So for me, the Super Nintendo version was the best version I could get. And that's just the version I remember playing. I loved renting this game as a kid. I never actually owned it, but I rented it all the time. It was one of my favorite games. Wing Commander is a 3D combat space simulator, and it's developed by Chris Roberts. If that name sounds familiar, you probably heard of it in discussions about Star Citizen, the modern space simulator that's coming out, who knows. The story of the game's pretty straightforward. Basically, you take on the role of a nameless player, and you're aboard the Tiger's Claw, which is kind of a big floating outpost in space. And then you'll take command of a little fighter spacecraft, and you'll have missions that you need to carry out. It's a lot of fun. The missions are usually a little different, and there's an interesting story that goes into each mission. One of the things I like about this game is that although it is definitely an action-oriented game, there's a lot of focus on story as well. In between missions, when you have downtime, you can hang out in the bar on the Tiger's Claw and talk to other members in your academy. Even though the characters are a little one-dimensional, this is pretty cool because it just kind of fleshes out the universe a little bit, and it makes it feel like you're part of a bigger universe. I also love the art design here. I love the cartoony appearance of the characters, and it kind of reminds me of the marionette action shows that I used to see when I was a kid growing up. Shows like Stingray and stuff like that.
Stand by for action!
It just kind of has that cheesy cornball sci-fi feel to it. It's just the right amount of cheesiness and cornball, but also fun and entertaining, and you're actually interested in the characters. Before each mission, you'll have a briefing that tells you what you have to do, and there's different types of missions, such as seek and destroy missions, missions where you have to provide an escort, as well as missions where you might have to take out a giant boss spaceship. The enemies are this weird breed of cats gone mad. They call themselves the Karathi, and they go around the galaxy trying to enslave the human race. And the conflict between them and the humans is kind of similar to the conflict between the Klingons and the humans in the Star Trek universe. There's basically just an ongoing conflict. It doesn't really matter, but it's a lot of fun playing through the missions, and it's a lot of fun just kind of taking part in this universe. One interesting thing is that when you fly out on some of the missions, some of the other characters will actually fly with you, so you might have one or two wingmen as you go through a mission. Some of the co-pilots are really good, like Spirit. She's really good at shooting down some of the enemies, but then there's other co-pilots who just are reckless and fire all over the place and will end up accidentally shooting you. Sometimes you have to tell them to stand down. It's interesting that they took the time to give all of the co-pilots their own different form of AI. And it's actually possible for your co-pilots to get shot down. If your co-pilot dies, that's it. It's permadeath. There'll be a funeral for him and everything. It's pretty wild. And it actually makes you feel like it's a really big deal when one of these characters dies in combat. They took the time to flesh out the story with these random cutscenes, and it's just enough to where the cutscenes are fun to watch without being too long. It's also possible to get different ships throughout the game. Sometimes you'll get promoted and your commander will give you a different ship. There's, I think, 4 different ships to choose from, and each one has their own different maneuvering capabilities. Each ship has their own look and feel, which is really cool. I know in a 3D game on Super Nintendo, you could only really do so much, and you could only use so much screen real estate to make the game still playable, but it was so worth the effort to take all the extra time and make all of these different cockpits to look at. There's all sorts of different things you can do in the cockpit as well. You can bring up a navigation screen and chart out where you want to go next, as well as use the radio to contact your wingman, and you can even taunt the enemy, which is kind of neat. This comes in handy on an escort mission if the enemy's getting too much fire on the ship that you're supposed to be escorting. You can also check out a damage report to see how much damage your ship's taken thus far. You can even eject from the ship if you have to. This leads to a pretty crazy sequence where you see your character floating helplessly in space. The first time you eject, you'll actually get an award from your commander, but anytime you do it after that, it just fails the mission and possibly sends you down the losing path of missions. That's another thing that kind of fleshes out the universe a little bit. You actually get different awards as you go through the game, and this is pretty cool. As you go through missions and kill bad guys, you'll start to rack up medals that you can view on your character. It's nothing major and it doesn't add anything to the gameplay specifically, but it's just kind of cool to look at and helps make it seem a little bit more realistic. And speaking of the missions, there's a winning path and a losing path. Not only can characters get killed along the way, and it's permadeath, but it's actually possible to lose at some of the missions but still be able to proceed through the game. The programmers put a large number of missions in there, but you won't necessarily see them all. If you're not successful at a mission, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but too many unsuccessful missions in a row will start to send things down a losing path in the ongoing battle against the Karathi. The cool thing is though, it's fun to just play it out no matter how the missions are going. The programmers encourage you to play out the missions as best you can, and not necessarily try to go for the best possible path. Just play it out and enjoy the ride. One downside to playing this on Super Nintendo is that because it is a simulator game and there's tons of different commands that you can put in, there's only so much you can do with a Super Nintendo controller. Therefore, a lot of the commands actually require two buttons to be held down at the same time. If you push select and the R button, you can toggle through whether or not you're using your radio, your targeting system, or your navigational computer. If you hold down select and Y, your ship will go into autopilot and just kind of warp you to the next nav point in your mission. If you hold down L and R and select and start, you'll eject. There's a bunch of other different commands, and it's a little tough to remember them all, but it's still a lot of fun to play, and it didn't hinder my enjoyment of the game. Another thing I love about this game is the music. The music is totally epic. Check this out. There's not a ton of different tracks, but they're all pretty awesome, and it gets you really excited to play the next mission. Although this game didn't really age that well on the Super Nintendo and the graphics probably aren't nearly as good as they would be on a high-end computer, I still feel like this game is very playable in Super Nintendo form, and it's worth taking a look at if that's all you have to work with. My only real complaint about this game is that the AI on the bad guys is not always up to par. Whenever you get into a dogfight with 3 or 4 of the bad guys, they usually come after you one at a time. The first 2 or 3 are pretty easy to take out, but it seems like the third one just goes all over the place and doesn't really have any rhyme or reason to it. I've had a couple of situations where the mission was really exciting, but then I ended up in a stalemate with this one nagging bad guy that was just kind of left behind. He would be just far enough away to where I couldn't shoot him, but I couldn't also just warp away to the next nav point. And then I'd end up just chasing the guy around in circles for 20 minutes, and I'd run out of fuel. That's another thing, you can run out of fuel in this game. I had one mission where I just flat ran out of fuel because I was chasing a guy around for too long, and then I had to eject. It doesn't happen very often, but it's enough to be noteworthy. Overall though, I love this game and can't recommend it enough. Whether or not you play it on Super Nintendo, or you play it on computer, or any of the other iterations that are out there, it's worth checking out if you've never played Wing Commander before. It's one of my all-time favorite games. If you have any interest in old space simulators, as well as science fiction, I think you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of it. There was Wing Commander as well as the expansion pack Wing Commander: The Secret Missions on Super Nintendo, and there were tons more sequels on PC as well as PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, and a few other systems. Pretty much whatever you got, you can probably find a version to check out. Well, that's all for this week. If you liked the video, feel free to like it as well as subscribe if you haven't already done so, and check out all of my other retro gaming content. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.